In this video, we're going to examine the Manchurian Crisis and what it reveals about the success of the League of Nations during the 1930s. The video is broken down into three separate sections. First, the causes of the crisis. Second, the events of the Manchurian Crisis. And finally, the consequences for the League of Nations. At the top of this video, you'll see a navigation bar and there's also timestamps so you can jump to the section you need. Manchuria was a province in northeast China. Part of its southern frontier bordered Korea. Although Manchuria was sparsely populated, it was extremely valuable. It was rich in mineral wealth, agricultural land and forestry. Japan had important interests in this area. Since 1905, Japan had controlled Korea and possessed trading rights that extended northwards into Manchuria. Japanese guards were permitted along the route of the South Manchurian Railway. Officially, their purpose was to maintain order in what was described as a lawless and chaotic area and to protect Japanese business interests. This meant that Japan already had a military and economic presence in Manchuria before the crisis began. One of the main reasons for the invasion was Japan's difficult economic position. Japan was an island trading nation and was badly affected by the Depression. It was not self-sufficient in food supply and relied on imports to feed its rapidly growing population. However, to pay for food imports, Japan had to make profit on its exports. Japan's main export was silk, which was a luxury product. As demand for silk overseas fell, Japanese exports declined and the country faced a growing economic crisis. Manchuria appeared to offer a solution for several of Japan's problems. First, it could provide Japan with food and raw materials. Second, it could provide a new market for Japanese exports. And finally, it could also provide land for Japan's surplus population. Therefore, Manchuria was attractive because of its resources, its land and its potential economic value. The immediate excuse for the invasion came in September 1931. Without permission from the civilian government, Japanese soldiers staged an incident along the railway line near Mukden. They used the excuse of Chinese banditry to launch an invasion of the surrounding area. Following the initial attacks, China appealed to the League of Nations for help. The Japanese government promised that its forces would withdraw. However, it soon became clear that Japan's civilian government was no longer in control of events. The Japanese army continued its advance and occupied the whole of the province of Manchuria. In March 1932, Manchuria was conquered and renamed Manchukuo. Japan had therefore used the railway incident as an excuse to take control of the entire province. Now we've looked at the causes, we'll move on to the events. China appealed to the League of Nations for help. The League of Nations could have called for sanctions against Japan, but it failed to do so. There were several reasons for this. Firstly, the European powers did not want to juice their trade with the Far East. They were particularly concerned that American businesses might take over any trade that European countries lost. Secondly, military sanctions were even less appealing. For military action to take place, European countries would have needed to send naval forces to the other side of the world. There was no guarantee that this military action would even succeed. Finally, Britain and France possessed colonies and important interests in the Far East, including Hong Kong and Singapore. They feared that imposing sanctions might provoke a Japanese attack against these possessions. As a result, the League was unwilling to use either economic or military sanctions. Although the League did not impose sanctions, it didn't feel as though it could do absolutely nothing. It appointed Lord Lytton to lead a commission of inquiry into Manchuria. Lytton was joined by a four-man team which included a representative from the United States. The commission spent 6 weeks in Manchuria investigating the situation. It concluded that although the Japanese had been provoked in various ways by the Chinese, the invasion was not justified. However, the investigation took a very long time. Lytton did not arrive in the Far East until April 1932. By this stage, Japan had already occupied Manchuria and was strengthening its control over the province. The League's assembly did not vote on the Lytton report until 18 months after Japan's original action. In February 1933, the findings of the report were accepted by a vote of 42-1. Japan responded by ending its membership of the League of Nations. We'll now move on to the consequences of the Manchurian Crisis for the League of Nations. The League can be criticised for failing to act quickly enough. By the time the investigation took place, Japan had already taken control of Manchuria and was strengthening its position. The League investigated the crisis, produced a report and declared that the invasion was not justified. However, it did not force Japan to leave Manchuria. It didn't impose economic sanctions and it didn't use military force against Japan. When the League accepted the Lytton report, Japan simply left the organisation. This meant that the League's decision had very little practical impact. It made the League look completely useless. Since the League took no action that made a difference, it brings us to the question, could the League have done more? Even with the benefit of hindsight, there appeared to be very little the League could have done to resolve this crisis. Neither Soviet Russia nor the United States was a member of the League at this time. This meant that the European powers could not call upon nearby military forces to deal with the invasion. The chances of economic sanctions succeeding during a period of worldwide recession also appeared to be remote. The European powers were unwilling to lose trade, feared for their possessions in the Far East, and did not want to risk military action on the other side of the world. These factors made it extremely difficult for the League to take any sort of effective action. The Manchurian Crisis was a serious failure for the League of Nations. The League correctly investigated the crisis and concluded that Japan's invasion was not justified. However, its response was extremely slow. The League refused to impose economic sanctions and was unwilling to use military force. Japan was therefore able to keep Manchuria and leave the League of Nations without facing any serious consequences. However, the crisis also showed the difficult position facing the League. The United States and Soviet Russia were not members. Military action was impractical and economic sanctions appeared unlikely to succeed during the Depression. At the time, many politicians believed these circumstances were unlikely to happen again. They were therefore prepared to give the League another chance. The Manchurian Crisis nevertheless demonstrated a major weakness. When a powerful country was prepared to use force, the League struggled to respond quickly or effectively.